The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the large, spotless kitchen. Sarah Mitchell stood before the open door, the cool air washing over her, but she felt nothing. She stared at the neatly organized shelves, the gallon of 2% milk, the clear container of leftover pasta, the row of yogurt cups, without really seeing any of it. It was 11:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. Upstairs, her husband, Mark, was asleep, his breathing a steady, familiar rhythm she could almost hear through the ceiling. Her children, Emily and Jake, were long lost in the dreams of the innocent. And here she was, a 38-year-old woman, feeling more like a ghost than a person, haunting her own life. This was the picture of success. The 4-bedroom colonial in a leafy suburban cul-de-sac. The minivan and the SUV parked in the driveway. Mark, a partner at his architectural firm, kind, stable, reliable. The children, bright and healthy. She had a part-time job coordinating events for the local library, a role that fit neatly into the school schedule. From the outside, it was a masterpiece. From the inside, it felt like a beautifully framed, empty canvas. She closed the fridge door, the click echoing in the silence. This restlessness was a new tenant in her soul, one that had moved in quietly over the past year. It wasn't that she was unhappy. That was the confusing part. She loved Mark. He was a good man, a good father. But their relationship had become a well-rehearsed play. They said their lines, performed their roles, pass the salt, how was your day, don't forget the parent-teacher conference, with a quiet efficiency that left no room for spontaneity. The passionate, adventurous man she'd married 15 years ago had been slowly sanded down by the pressures of mortgages and quarterly reports and pediatrician appointments, replaced by a comfortable, predictable stranger. And she feared the same had happened to her. The feeling had a name, though she refused to speak it aloud, even in the privacy of her own mind. It was a hollow ache, a yearning for something more. It was the reason she found herself standing in kitchens in the dead of night, feeling like she was waiting for a train that had already left the station. The PTA fundraiser for Oakwood Elementary was always held in the sterile but functional community hall. Sarah was in her element, arranging centerpieces, checking name tags, directing volunteers. This was her world, organized, purposeful, and safe. "Sarah, thank God you're here," said Lisa, the committee head, fluttering over with a clipboard. "The audiovisual guy is setting up, but he says the projector cable is too short. Can you talk to him? You're so much better with these technical people." Sarah nodded, forcing a smile. She weaved through the round tables draped in white linen, heading towards the small stage. And that's when she saw him. He wasn't what she expected. Most of the AV contractors were either bored teenagers or gruff, older men. This man was probably in his late 30s, with dark, slightly unruly hair and intense, focused eyes the color of sea glass. He was on his knees behind the podium, his back to her, a tangle of cables spread around him like a synthetic nest. He wore a simple black t-shirt and jeans, and there was a quiet competence in his movements. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice softer than she intended. He turned, and his eyes met hers. It was just a look, a simple, professional acknowledgement. But for Sarah, it felt like a jolt. A tiny, silent crackle of energy passed between them, so fleeting she was sure she'd imagined it. "Hi, David Chen," he said, standing and wiping his hands on his jeans. He had a nice smile, warm and genuine. "You must be my point of contact." "Sarah." "Yes, Sarah Mitchell." She gestured vaguely towards the projector. "Lisa said there's a cable issue." "Nothing major," he said, his voice a calm, steady baritone. "Just have to reroute it. I'll have it sorted in 5 minutes. Won't be a problem." His confidence was reassuring. "Great, thank you, David." She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, feeling strangely awkward, before turning to attend to another crisis involving the vegetarian meal options. For the rest of the evening, she was acutely aware of his presence in the room. She'd catch a glimpse of him adjusting a microphone, or see him leaning against the back wall, observing the proceedings with a quiet, almost amused detachment. She found herself wondering what he was thinking. His world seemed so different from hers, unscripted, technical, real. At the end of the night, as the volunteers were packing up, he approached her. "All systems are shut down," he reported. "Everything went smoothly. Thank you for your help, David. You saved us." "Just doing my job." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and handed her a business card. "If you have any other events, at the library or wherever, feel free to call. I do private gigs, too." Their fingers brushed during the exchange. It was an accident, a mundane physical contact. But for Sarah, it was like a spark on dry tinder. A heat rushed up her arm, settling in her cheeks. She looked down at the simple white card. David Chen, Audiovisual Solutions. I will. Thank you, she stammered, slipping the card into her purse as if it were a secret. He gave her a final nod and walked away. She watched him go, a strange, fluttering sensation in her chest. It was the first feeling she'd felt in months that wasn't tinged with a vague sense of duty or melancholy. Weeks passed. Life returned to its normal rhythm. School runs, grocery shopping, helping with homework, date nights with Mark that were pleasant but predictable. Yet, David's business card remained in her wallet, a small, persistent piece of static in the background of her life. The opportunity presented itself innocently enough. The library was hosting a local author's talk, and their usual tech volunteer had fallen ill. Sarah's boss was panicking. I can call someone, Sarah heard herself say, her heart hammering against her ribs. I have a card for a reliable AV guy. And just like that, she was dialing his number. His voice on the phone was just as she remembered, calm, professional. The author event was a success. David was efficient, invisible until he was needed. Afterwards, as he was packing his gear, he turned to her. You want to grab a coffee? He asked. It was so direct, so simple. I missed my afternoon caffeine fix, and I'm about to crash. Every rational part of her screamed to say no. To thank him and go home to her family. But the hollow ache in her chest was louder. Sure, she said, her voice barely a whisper. There's a place around the corner. Sitting across from him in the quiet coffee shop, the dynamic shifted. It was no longer client and contractor. It was a man and a woman. He told her about his life. He'd been a musician in his 20s, traveling with a band, living out of a van. When that dream faded, he'd used his technical knowledge to start his own business. He was divorced, amicably, with no kids. He spoke of freedom and regrets with equal weight. Sarah found herself talking more than she had in years. She talked about her love for classic literature, a passion she'd shelved since college. She confessed her fear that she was becoming boring, that her life was a checklist she'd long since completed. She didn't mention the depth of her marital discontent, but she didn't have to. He listened, truly listened, in a way Mark hadn't in a long time. He didn't offer solutions, he just absorbed her words, his sea-glass eyes fixed on her, making her feel seen. Truly seen. It sounds like you're on autopilot, he said gently. Sometimes, you just need to remember you're the one flying the plane. The statement was so simple, yet it felt revolutionary. When they parted, standing by their respective cars in the fading evening light, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. I'd like to see you again, Sarah, David said. It wasn't a demand, just a statement of fact. I'm married, she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. I know, he said softly. I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give. I like talking to you. That was the beginning of the end of her resistance. It started with emails, innocent at first, discussing a book she'd mentioned, a piece of music he thought she'd like. Then the emails became longer, more personal. They became the highlight of her day. She'd sneak moments to check her inbox while folding laundry, or late at night after Mark was asleep. Each message was a tiny infusion of color into her gray world. Then came the first lunch. Then a walk in the park. Each meeting was a boundary carefully crossed, a line in the sand slowly erased by the tide of her growing feelings. She told herself they were just friends. That she deserved a friend. But the chemistry between them was a palpable force. A brush of his hand against her shoulder would send a shiver down her spine. The way he looked at her made her feel beautiful, interesting, alive, feelings she hadn't realized she'd been starving for. The guilt was a constant, gnawing companion. She'd look at Mark, who was trying his best in his own oblivious way, and feel a wave of self-loathing. She'd hug her children tightly, their unconditional love feeling like a judgment. She was building a secret life, brick by brick, and with each brick, the wall between her and her family grew higher. One rainy afternoon, they found themselves in his studio, a converted garage space filled with sound equipment and instruments. They were supposed to be listening to a recording he'd made of a local band. The music was playing, a soulful, melancholic tune, but they weren't listening. They were standing in the middle of the room, caught in a silence that was louder than any music. I can't do this anymore, Sarah, David said, his voice rough with emotion. These stolen moments. I'm falling for you, and it's killing me. Tears welled in her eyes. I know, she choked out. I can't fight it either. And she couldn't. The battle was over. The yearning, the connection, the sheer magnetic pull she felt towards him had overwhelmed every defense she had. All the rationalizations, all the guilt, it all crumbled in that moment. He stepped closer, his hand coming up to cradle her face. His thumb gently wiped away a tear that had escaped. The touch was electric, a current of pure, undiluted feeling that shattered the last of her resolve. I'm so lost, she confessed, her body trembling. Then let me find you, he whispered. And he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a confession, a surrender, a claiming. It was everything she had been missing for a decade. It was passion and desperation and a sense of coming home to a place she never knew existed. In that kiss, the married woman, the mother, the PTA coordinator, they all fell away, and there was only Sarah, a woman rediscovering the raw, aching need of her own heart. For the next few months, she lived a double life. She became a master of deception, crafting elaborate alibis for her time with David. A book club that met surprisingly often. Late work meetings, at the library. She was a ghost in her own home, her body present but her spirit miles away, in David's arms, in his studio, laughing and talking and feeling more herself than she ever had. The guilt didn't disappear, but it was muted, drowned out by the symphony of her reawakened senses. With David, she felt vibrant. He encouraged her to write again, something she'd abandoned after college. He played her music that made her soul ache. He saw the woman she used to be, and the woman she could still become. But the lies began to pile up, creating a precarious house of cards. Mark, while not suspicious, became more distant, sensing a shift he couldn't name. He started working later, perhaps subconsciously creating space for a chasm that was already there. The distance between them in their king-sized bed felt like a canyon. The breaking point came on a perfectly ordinary Sunday. They were at a neighborhood barbecue. The sun was shining, children were laughing, and it was a scene of suburban perfection. Mark was chatting with the neighbors about golf. Sarah was putting out a pasta salad she'd made, her hands shaking slightly. Her phone, left on the patio table, buzzed. A text message lit up the screen. She was across the yard, but Mark, reaching for a napkin, glanced down. It was from David. I can't stop thinking about yesterday. Every time I close my eyes, I see you. The world slowed to a crawl. Sarah saw Mark's face change. The easy, relaxed expression melted away, replaced by a slow dawning horror. He didn't pick up the phone. He didn't yell. He just stared at the screen, his jaw tightening, his face turning ashen. He looked up, and his eyes found hers across the lawn. In that single, devastating glance, everything was communicated. The betrayal, the shock, the utter collapse of his reality. He turned without a word and walked into the house. The ride home was a silence so profound it was deafening. The children, sensing the tension, were quiet in the backseat. When they got home, Mark sent the kids to their rooms to play. He stood in the living room, his back to her, shoulders rigid. Who was he? The question was quiet, laced with a pain that made her flinch. There was no point in lying. The truth was right there, in that text, in the hollowed-out look on his face. His name is David, she said, her voice trembling. He turned, and the raw agony in his eyes was worse than any anger. How long? And so, she told him. Not everything, but enough. She spoke of her loneliness, her feeling of being invisible, the slow death of their connection. She didn't try to justify the affair, but she explained the emptiness that had made her vulnerable to it. Mark listened, his face a mask of stoic pain. When she finished, he just shook his head. All you had to do was talk to me, Sarah, he whispered, his voice breaking. Why didn't you just talk to me? There was no answer that would suffice. She had chosen the path of greatest destruction. The following days were a special kind of hell. Mark moved into the guest room. They maintained a fragile peace for the children, but the house was filled with the ghost of what had been shattered. Emily, her perceptive 11-year-old, asked, Mom, are you and Dad okay? The question was a knife to Sarah's heart. She knew she had to end it with David. It was the only path forward, no matter how painful. She met him at a neutral location, a bleak, anonymous park. I can't see you anymore, she said, the words tearing out of her. Mark knows. David's face fell. Leave him, Sarah, come be with me, we can make this work. For a moment, the temptation was overwhelming. The promise of a life filled with passion and understanding, a life where she could be the woman she was with him. But she looked at him, this man who had awakened her heart, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that a relationship born from such profound betrayal could never be the foundation for a healthy life. The guilt would always be there. The shadow of her broken family would always loom over them. I can't, she said, tears streaming down her face. My children, I have to try and fix what I've broken. I have to see if there's anything left to save. The look in his eyes was one of utter heartbreak. He nodded, accepting her decision with a dignity that made her love him even more in that moment. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, a final, bittersweet goodbye. I hope you find your happiness, Sarah, he whispered, and then he turned and walked away. Watching him leave felt like having a part of her soul ripped out. The color drained from the world, leaving it once again in shades of gray. But this gray was different. It wasn't the gray of numbness, it was the gray of grief, of consequence, of a painful, hard-won clarity. The journey back was long and arduous. Marriage counseling was brutal. They had to tear down the ruins of their old relationship to see if there was a foundation strong enough to build something new. They had to relearn how to talk, how to listen, how to be vulnerable with each other. Mark's trust was shattered, and rebuilding it was a daily, conscious effort. There were days filled with anger, with tears, with a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Sarah had to confront the person she had become. The woman who had been so focused on her own emptiness that she was willing to detonate her entire family to fill it. She started individual therapy, digging into the roots of her discontent. She realized her affair with David, while feeling like a rebellion, was actually a symptom of a much deeper problem, her own inability to communicate her needs and her failure to take responsibility for her own happiness. Slowly, painstakingly, she and Mark began to rebuild. It wasn't the same marriage. The innocent, unquestioning trust was gone forever, replaced by something more fragile, more conscious, and in a strange way, more honest. They started dating again. They had difficult conversations they'd avoided for years. They learned to appreciate each other not just as partners and parents, but as the flawed, complex individuals they were. One evening, almost a year after the text message that shattered their world, they were sitting on the back porch, watching the fireflies blink in the twilight. It was a comfortable silence, the first one in a very long time. I'm not going to say I'm thankful for what happened, Mark said, his voice quiet in the gathering dark. But I think we were both asleep in this marriage. It took a nuclear bomb to wake us up. Sarah looked at him, at the new lines of pain and wisdom around his eyes, and she felt a surge of love for him, not the passionate, dizzying love she'd felt for David, but a deeper, more resilient love, forged in the fires of failure and forgiveness. I'm so sorry, Mark, she said, for the 1000th time. I know, he said, taking her hand. Me too. She couldn't fight her feelings for David. They had been too powerful, too all-consuming. They had shown her a version of herself she had forgotten. But in the end, she had to fight for something more important. She had to fight for her family. She had to fight for the man who, despite everything, was still willing to fight for her. Her story wasn't a fairy tale. There was no guaranteed, happily ever after. It was a story of a profound moral failure and a long, difficult road toward redemption. It was a story about the destructive power of unmet needs and the transformative power of taking responsibility. The title of her life wasn't, I couldn't fight my feelings anymore. It was becoming, I chose to fight for what mattered. And that, she was beginning to understand, was a much harder, but ultimately more meaningful, story to tell.